Okay, as I was saying earlier, today we're going to wrap up our exploration of the modern period in philosophy, or at least what we might call the early modern. So we're talking about the 1600s, 1700s, and then Kant is seen as kind of the last of the great Enlightenment thinkers, and he dies in 1804. And so we'll get to Kant by the end of the lecture today. One of the main issues we're going to be talking about, it's not the only thing, there's actually, in a way, this meeting is almost like a smorgasbord, a variety pack of philosophy. We're going to be talking about a lot of different stuff in philosophy, but one of the main issues is one we've been looking at already. And in fact, it was, I guess, the focus of the last meditation of Descartes, or it was one of the foci, this relationship between how the world appears to us and how the world actually is. What is the thing in itself? You know, I'm looking out at this object, which I assume is out there. For all I know, it can just be an idea in my head. But I assume I'm looking at a tree, for instance. But how do I know that my experience, this representation in the mind, as we have on the diagram here, how do I know that it squares with reality? So that's one issue that I'm going to come back to here in a second. But there's something we left untouched, which is really probably one of the more important aspects of the sixth meditation, and it's Descartes' insistence that the mind and the body are two distinct, separate things. We are a combination of both. Okay, so we have a mind, obviously, we're a thinking thing for Descartes. But we're tied to a body. He believes that that body's real. He's got these arguments why it must be real. Otherwise, it'd be very deceptive of God to make us think that. So, the body must be something that we actually do have. It is something that's part of reality. And so he seems to think that this is just established hard fact. Okay, good enough, great. I'm not going to push him back on that. But the question immediately arises for Descartes is, if the mind is completely independent, you don't need a body to have a mind. Descartes is insistent of. If you take away all that's physical, all that's corporeal, that's the word he likes to use, you've got your mind, and you don't need a body. Is somebody trying to talk? I'm hearing a little bit of background noise. Make sure you got your mic muted if you're not talking. You're not going to, if you want to ask a question, jump in at any moment, but otherwise, please hit mute. All right, but anyways, yeah, so back to this relationship between the mind and the body. Descartes insists that we are part one, part mind, part body. The mind is the ruler over the body. This is known as Descartes' mind-body dualism. And so I've got this chart up here on the screen. You can see I'm going to get into these other philosophers in just a moment, but we're still on Descartes. So, Descartes' philosophy is a dualistic philosophy. His metaphysics, the way he sees reality, is dualistic. He thinks that all the universe is composed of substance, and basically you've got either extended substance or unextended substance. And so what is the difference? Remember, extension in this context, we're talking about spatial extension. Something is extended in space. It takes up space. So some substances are extended. For instance, my body. And some substances are unextended. They don't take up any space. For instance, my mind. So the mind is something that's non-physical. Thought is something that's non-physical. And yet it's attached to something that is. It's attached to something that is extended, something that is an extended substance, namely my body. So that's Descartes' dualism there. That's his mind-body dualism. And he's a dualist with regard to other things. There's physical matter. There's, actual like tables and chairs out there, and then there's the thought of those things in my mind, and the thoughts are unextended. The stuff is actually, you know, the physical extended stuff takes up space. It's material. So this is a form of dualism. We've actually seen dualism before, believe it or not. I don't know if I've ever used that term before, but Plato is a sort of a dualist, you could say. He believes not that there's two types of things in the universe. You know, there's many types of substances for him, but he's a dualist in the sense that there are two realities. Remember, for Plato, there's the higher realm of form, the intelligible realm, the non-physical perfect realm of forms, where beauty itself is, the good itself, and then there's the physical realm. So Plato is also a dualist for different reasons, right? A different type of dualist. But Descartes, his dualism, this Cartesian dualism, it leads to a sort of a problem that's known as the mind-body problem. And if you ever decide for some reason to study philosophy in more depth, and you ever take a class in philosophy of mind, you'll definitely cover this in more depth than I'm going to, you know, cover it right now. The mind-body problem, and this is only a problem for dualists, by the way. So if you're like Descartes and you believe that, you know, I'm a human being and I'm made up of these two types of substances. I'm a thinking thing primarily. That's my essence, is my thought. I'm a mind. But I'm also attached to a body, right? If you've got that sort of dualistic picture, this mind-body problem will apply to your philosophy. So the problem is this: if the mind is non-physical, if the mind has no physical content at all, it's an unextended thing, as Descartes would say. Then how does it control something that is? In other words, how does the mind move the body? If the mind is something completely independent of the body. I mean, Descartes, to say that it's completely independent might be disingenuous. Oh, somebody's messaging me in the chat box, so I'm getting a bit distracted. Okay, there's a few people who are emailing me about their papers. I know there's at least 2 or 3 more I've got to get to, so that might be you. If that's you, please hold off. I'm so behind on grading. I finally caught up with grading for this class, and then now I'm behind because some people didn't turn it in right, and I've got other classes that turn stuff in, so I'm trying to keep it all straight in my head right now. But, you know, please, you know, give me to the end of this week, or actually probably give me till next class. I guess in a couple days, I should have everything straight. I'm hoping that we'll get done with class early today, and I'll be able to, before the next class even starts, I'll be able to sort of, you know, at least get my emails in order. And I think that your email is waiting for me to open. So that's probably the deal. So, okay. Back to the mind-body problem. Again, if the mind is something that is completely non-physical, doesn't take up any space, has no physical aspects whatever, it's just a thinking thing, an unextended substance, how does it control the body? Descartes insists that it does. You know, Descartes, he says, well, of course, there's communication between both, right? The body will send signals to the mind. The body will tell the mind it's thirsty, it needs water. But ultimately, the mind is what controls the body and says, all right, I'll take a sip of this water, fine. It's the mind that controls it. How? How does that work? How does the mind control the body if it's not a physical thing? Anybody have any possible hypotheses that they could throw out there, and you know, any guesses how we might solve the mind-body problem? How does something non-physical affect something physical?
I think just like water itself, like how when you drink water, it fuels the body. I think that could relate to the brain effect.
See, but yeah, I mean that.
Because it's an outside source, and
right?
It's not. I mean, it's physical, and it affects something that's, you know.
That's
So
what I was going to get to. Like maybe what you're saying might be a nice analogy. Like oh, it's kind of like that, but it can't be exactly because, like you said, water's a physical thing, the brain is a physical thing. So if the mind is a completely non-physical thing, you know, it's very mysterious how it could have this force on the body. And Descartes, you know, he's in a bit of a pickle. He's not really sure how he's going to answer this. The problem is brought up to him by one of his friends, Princess Elizabeth. She was this princess in exile who he had, you know, befriended, and they had this correspondence. They had written letters back and forth, and she called him out on this. She said, "I liked your essay; it was very interesting, but you don't explain the interaction between the mind and the body. You just assert it's the case." And his response was just basically, "Well, it just does." And you're overthinking it. And you know, women shouldn't think too much about metaphysics or something sexist like that. And she wrote him back and tore into him. You know, I read the letter. I read this correspondence between the two, and she basically, like, you know, pulls out some physics, and she's like, "Look, I've read tons of books on physics, and movement is caused by force, and you know, force is, you know, implies mass and energy, mass and or energy. So you've got to have something that has got force, and that implies a body or something physical, mass moving mass, something's pushed. So how does the mind?" And she even says she agrees with him. She says something like, I believe it does. You know, you're right. I think the mind does move the body. I experience it. You know, it does seem like my mind can control my body when I want it to. But how? How does it do this? You haven't answered that question. How? What is the nature of the interaction? How? Yeah, I know there's a few people in here who are psychology majors. I don't know how far you are along in your degree, but what sort of answer might you get today if you're not, you know, not from Descartes, but how does the mind control the body? What would the answer? What would a scientist perhaps say? No one's familiar with what the scientific answer to this would be? It's definitely not one that Descartes would like, you know, for sure. They're going to have to basically dismiss this dualistic philosophy.
Well, if you're going with the scientific approach, wouldn't this be the brain uh,
Right,
controls your body through nerves and all
right,
that?
right. So it's a completely physical explanation. Exactly. So the mind is just it's a physical process. It's a biological process that's the result of, as you say, your brain functioning in a certain way, sending electrical signals to your brain and such. And that's kind of the materialist. You know, there's no non-physical stuff. It's just material stuff. Uh, in a way, you know, that's probably a good way to go about it if you're a scientist. But you know, if you ever take a class, at least when I was in grad school, this has been a while, right? Maybe almost a decade now. So, you know, when I was in grad school, when you took philosophy of mind, they would usually teach you this stuff. They would teach you Descartes just to tell you how wrong it was and how bad he was and how dualism just doesn't work. And I understand it's fairly problematic, right? It's sort of, you know, and Descartes, his answer is really bad. He says something like, "Oh, the soul or the mind, it's located in your pineal gland, which is right at the base of your skull. And whenever it wants to move the body, it turns itself into a vapor, like this half extended, half unextended mist, and it moves your body around." You know, that sounds just like an ad hoc hypothesis, like he's just making something up just to move along and not worry about it. But on the other hand, I think that, you know, the materialist explanation that, oh, it's just the brain and it's just electrons, that kind of answers the question of how consciousness comes about and what makes us think. Why do we have thoughts? But it doesn't really answer the question of what consciousness is. You know, what is it? What is this mystery? What is thought? And there's a contemporary philosopher of mine, I think, is it Chalmers? I think it's Chalmers who brings this up. He says there's the easy question, about the mind, and there's the hard question about the mind. And the scientists, as difficult as the question is, the scientists are answering the easy question. You know, let's just look at brain scans and look at electrons firing in your brain, and that's thought. That's thought. Okay. No, that's what causes thought. Those are the mechanics of it. But what is thought itself? Is it really, like, you want to call it a physical thing? This is maybe a philosophical question that perhaps can't be answered. You know, for someone like Wittgenstein or maybe a Heidegger, they're going to say you can't even answer this question. So, like, you'd have to be able to step outside of thought to define it in an objective way, and that's just not possible. So, you know, to be fair to Descartes, I think the materialist explanation that it's just all matter, it's all just your brain, as useful as it is, and as much as I just believe it, that's my go-to answer. It's not without its own sort of problems. It is maybe oversimplistic and somewhat reductionist. So anyways, all right, well, I've done enough Descartes. I think we need to move on. So I'm going to talk a little bit, not a lot, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about some other philosophers during this time period. I'm going to talk about some other rationalists. And also, on the flip side, we're going to look at the empiricists. So let's just remind ourselves, what's the difference? Descartes was a rationalist. And so the rationalists basically are going to argue that when it comes to knowing something, when it comes to knowledge, all of your knowledge is based on your reasoning, you know, rationality, rationalism. So your ability to understand concepts and your ability to draw conclusions from those concepts. That's where all knowledge is based. Your senses and your imagination, actually, your ability to picture things in your head, although useful tools, are not to be relied on for knowledge. That's the basic rationalist approach. So if you look at this picture that we've been kind of staring at for the last week or two, where you got this guy who, you know, looks like a total dork, right? He's like, oh, look at the tree, whatever, right? This picture is misleading in a sense from the rationalist perspective. They're going to maintain that, sure, this is typically what happens, right? Typically, we look out at the world outside of us, this world that we intuitively consider external to ourselves, and we see objects, we see things in it, and they're presented to our mind. The problem with that is they appear in ways that they aren't. So that, like, for instance, Descartes says the sun appears smaller than it actually is. It's much larger than it appears. And it looks closer than it's much further away than it appears. Because it's so hot, it might give you the impression that it's a lot closer to the earth and all these things. It appears that the earth is stationary. It doesn't feel like it's moving or spinning on its axis, but that's just appearance. Those are your senses. Reason will let you know, deduce what's real and what's true. And the way towards truth, by and large, whether you're Descartes or any of the other rationalists, the way towards truth seems to be primarily through mathematical reasoning. So mathematics, geometry, I look at the world around me that my senses presents to me, and I abstract all that I can measure. Anything that I can mathematically understand, that is absolute, that is true, that is the thing in itself. That's not a very fancy term. You know, usually these philosophers will come up with some, you know, wacky Latin, you know, or Greek-based jargon to describe something, but not in this case, right? In this case, they're just, you know, again, they come up with this term, the thing in itself. I just typed that into the chat box, the thing in itself. What is the thing in itself? The rationalists say, whatever you know about it mathematically, that's the thing in itself. You can extract all the sensual qualities, the color, all that stuff is subjective and based on your own perceptions. But what's true objectively is the mathematical, you know, the shapes, the depth, and all that sort of thing, things you can measure. Okay, so it's all about mathematics. That's going to get you to the thing in itself. And people like Leibniz, okay, so let me go to the next slide here. They're going to take this I don't know what the word I would use would be to its extreme. I mean, I don't say extreme, but Leibniz is a brilliant man who, along with Newton, I want to give Newton credit as well, Sir Isaac Newton. He developed calculus. Okay, so he's not a dummy, but his ideas were he took the rationalist creed to the extreme, and so for Leibniz, everything could be understood in terms of calculus. Calculus was the tool, mathematical calculus was the tool that you could use to understand all that was going on in the universe, all of your perceptions, all the events that were going on, all scientific truths, physics, etc. And unlike Descartes, he did not want to separate philosophy from theology. So let me see if I can get, I'm going to get like a little, one of these dealios. It's not very dark. Let me see if I can change the color. No, that's not what I want to do. Nope, that ain't it either. There we go. That's what I want. Okay. So Leibniz and Spinoza, unlike Descartes, they were both on the same page about this, that you can't really separate philosophy and a study of nature, study of science, study of nature, from a study of God. So God is central. Understanding God is central to understand the universe. For Descartes, it wasn't. You might be thinking, well, wait a minute. I thought Descartes spent a lot of time talking about God. Haven't we talked about God the last couple of weeks and proofs for God's existence? That's true. But when Descartes proves that God exists, he moves on. Okay, he's like, that's all I need. All I need God for is to know that I'm not being constantly deceived and that physical objects exist apart from me. And that's all I need. Besides that, Descartes' going to let the church deal with all the religious questions, and talk about God's nature and the relationship between God and nature. Descartes wants to separate philosophy, science from religion. Leibniz and Spinoza, it's not so clear cut. They think that studying God and studying nature is studying the same thing. And so they're both partaking in, let me write this down on the slide. They're both involved in natural religion. This is the name of that practice that Leibniz and Spinoza popularized. Okay, their way of doing philosophy. Again, it's known as natural religion, coming off the page there. But this way of doing philosophy, using logic to prove theological truth. Descartes wants to get away from that. So do the empiricists, by the way. When we get to David Hume, he attacks natural religion. He says philosophy needs to stop doing this. You can't use philosophy and science to prove things about the supernatural. You have to keep it to the natural world. You've got to keep these two separate. Leibniz and Spinoza don't seem to think so. They think nature is, since God is the creator, then we must understand God's being and the being of God, and that will help us understand the being of nature. So Leibniz, that's one difference between him and Descartes, is that God is central to his understanding of physics and the natural world. But he also takes this other approach. He applies mathematics to the physical world, and he deduces that if you want to get to this thing in itself, what's the actual thing out there, not the way it appears to me, but how it actually is. For Leibniz, he was not a dualist. He was what we would call today an atomist. So Leibniz's philosophy is a form of atomism. So he thought that the universe could be understood and was broken up into these discrete particles. Okay, you can understand these particles using calculus, but everything is made up of these small, minute particles. They're indivisible, the smallest unit possible. He called them monads. is the term, as opposed to a dyad or a triad or whatever. They're the smallest unit possible. Every thing that we see is a interaction between all these different particles, and they're all moving towards perfection. In fact, they've already completed it, but we just can't see it because we're imperfect beings. We see all time sort of imperfectly. Of course, God can see it all, and God programmed it all. And so for Leibniz, he insists that we live in the best of all possible worlds. Because and you might think, well, geez, this is the best of all possible worlds. It seems like we could live in a world that's better. Doesn't it seem like we can live in a world where there's less hunger and there's less starvation, there's less murder, there's less natural disasters? But Leibniz insists that no, this is the best of all possible worlds. God made it. If he could have made it better, he would have. And in fact, it's the best ever. And if you could step back and see the whole picture, you would be able to see that everything happens for a reason, and it's just the perfect reason, and that's why. It's God's computer program working itself out towards this perfect finality or something like this. Now, Spinoza, he's, I guess you could say he's Leibniz's buddy. And he's very much, I gotta widen this a bit here. Okay. He takes a similar tact. Okay, so God is the explanatory principle. If you understand God and understand what it means to be infinite, perfect, all these things, everything else follows from that. All other truths flow from that. But he rejected Leibniz's atomism, and instead he advocated for a form of monism. Monism, that's another jargony term. It's not the same thing as monotheism, although he was a monotheist. Does anybody know what is monotheism? Anybody in here familiar with that term if you're monotheistic?
The belief of one God.
Right, correct. So you only believe in one God. Monism, similarly, there's a belief in only one substance. Everything is all one thing. So there's not a bunch of different stuff. It's all just one substance, one unit. All things are one. That's Spinoza. So that's very interesting. Not only is he a monotheist, he believes in God, that there's only one God, but he also believes there's only one thing. So put those together, what is everything? Everything that is one substance. Oh, and by the way, God exists, and he's one. So what is everything? What will follow from that?
Basically, everything's God.
Yes, yeah. So, and that view is known as pantheism. So he's a monotheist, a pantheist, and a monist all at once, right? He believes that everything that is, the whole universe, all taken together as a whole, is God, and we're all a part of it. We're all. He sometimes talks about us as modes, that we're modes of God or modalities of God. And evil, whatever's evil, is just an absence. It's a void, or a donut hole in God or something like this. So. And like, as I mentioned, these men were brilliant, but they had some pretty wild ideas. They weren't stupid. The guy Leibniz, he created the first calculator. It could, I think, do operations up to 4 or 5 decimal points. This guy's living in the 1600s, and he's making calculators. So he was no dummy, but he was pretty, I don't know, maybe he had a little arrogance, something like that, because he was so smart. And he made a lot of assertions that you're going to see when we get to David Hume. And I'm not going to talk too much about Hume and Locke and Berkeley. I want to get through these guys so we can set things up for next class, talk more in depth about Sartre. But you're going to see that they reject a lot of this stuff. Like David Hume thinks that natural religion, and really not just natural religion, not just philosophy that uses argumentation and so-called logic to establish religious principles, but really any metaphysics at all, any assertions about the nature of the fundamental nature of the universe, David Hume thinks that are arrogant. These assertions are arrogant. You're vain. You must think you're pretty special if you can understand the nature of the divine being, or even if there is one. You can't prove it either way. David Hume seemed to be a philosophical agnostic. He thought these were matters of faith. He claimed to have this faith himself privately, but he never argued about it in his philosophy. But if you go back to the first slide here and look at our image, you've got all the rationalists telling you that, look, if you want to get to truth, don't look to it in representations in your mind. You have to think about the ideas themselves. And so think about the concept of treeness, and the concept of plantness, and the concept of life, and the concept of being, and the concept of, just get as vague as you can. And then apparently, for Leibniz, you get to the monads, and you can understand everything in terms of these simple units. And everything is just completely abstract. And if you can picture it in your head, it's not the thing in itself. If you're picturing a circle, that's not truth. That's close to the truth, but you have to just think about circularity itself, triangularity itself, without any pictures in your mind. And the empiricists tend to reject this, especially people like Berkeley. He's like, what do you picture? Like, you can't have a thought that doesn't have some content. Even if you're thinking about circularity itself, you're using language, you're using some internal dialogue. Thought always has content. So how do the empiricists deal with this problem of the thing in itself? How do we get to the actual tree? All I have is my experience, so how do I get to the actual thing that's behind my experience? Well, most of the empiricists, at least the big ones, they just give it up. They don't even try. John Locke, he says, the thing in itself, it's something. He believes, hey, I believe there's a tree out there. I believe it, okay? I believe there's a desk beneath me in a chair. I believe it. But what it is itself, without me seeing it, I don't know, and I never can. So let's just stop asking that stupid question. That's pretty much John Locke's approach. It's something, there's something out there, but I'm stuck with my mind. I'm stuck with my experience. And so let's just focus on how I experience those objects. And let me try to see if maybe I can get to some features, some qualities. He talks about qualities, features, qualities, attributes, whatever. Let's try to see if there's things that seem to be more, they're more dependent upon me and my state. And let's see if there are some things that I experience in the object that aren't dependent on me and aren't dependent on my state. And so John Locke says there are certain qualities, that's the term he uses, that are primary. So he says there are some qualities that are not dependent on me. They seem to be dependent on the object that I'm seeing, that I'm looking at. Other qualities are secondary. They seem to depend on the state that I'm in. They seem to depend on me and how I feel, what angle I'm looking at, and those sort of things. And so what's the difference? Well, he would say things like the density, right? Like how dense, if I squeeze my phone, how dense it is. The shape of my phone. Those are primary, he says. Whereas the color of my phone, the smell, the taste, I'm not going to put the phone in my mouth, but so those would be secondary qualities. Why do you think he distinguishes between those? So why would he say, like, for instance, that shape and density of this phone are primary, whereas the color of it is secondary? The color of it, the smell, is secondary. Any clue? What's his intuition here? Why would he assert this? Why would one be more, again, and the idea is that the primary qualities are more essential to the object. The secondary ones are less so. They seem to emanate from the object, whereas the secondary ones don't seem to depend on the object. Well, how do I see so if color is secondary, that's my eyesight, and taste is secondary. That's my tongue, my taste buds. Smell is my nose. I guess he would say the sound would be secondary as well if it makes a sound is secondary, but the shape of this phone and how dense it is, if I squeeze it, it's the density. Those are primary. No one has a clue? Why would the shape and the density be like essential or primary to the object, and then the other qualities not so much? Well, let's imagine that this phone was completely white. Okay, like I spray painted it white with phone paint. I just made up a paint, right? I don't like this color. I mean, I want it to be different. Everyone's got a black phone. I want it to stand out, so I'm just gonna make it all bright white. And I have to probably clean it all the time because it's gonna get all ugly. But whatever, right? So I got a white phone, okay? And I take this phone and I put it into a very dark room, and I shine a red light on the phone. Is the phone gonna look white?
No.
Not really.
No,
At least not the same sort of intensity as you intend it to be.
Right. So yeah, it's not going to be a bright white anymore. It's going to look red. If I put a red light on it, it's going to look red. If I put a blue light on it, it's going to look blue, and so on and so forth. But the shape of the phone is going to look the same, right? It's still going to have the same shape, whether or not, so the light might change the color, the way that so the conditions of the room, the conditions of the lighting might change the way that the color appears, but it's not going to change the way the shape appears. And if I go up to the phone, I grab it and I squeeze it, it's going to have the same density that it did before. And so for John Locke, he's going to argue that things like color seem to depend more on me, and maybe like the lighting conditions, where I'm standing, how far away I am, whereas the shape seems to be in the object. It seems to be something that emanates from outside of me. And same thing with the density. Imagine you walk to school every morning, let's say, and on the way to school, you walk by a restaurant, let's say it's like a pizza parlor. And so one morning you walk by that building and you're hungry, you haven't had your breakfast yet, and your stomach's all grumbling. And so you're smelling all the food. They're baking bread. You can smell the garlic. You smell all the pizza sauce, and you're hungry, so you're going to be like, wow. So the smells are going to be intense and going to draw you in. And maybe even the sounds, you're going to like listen to the people cooking and all this stuff. Okay. Now imagine like a week later, you walk by, but you're all stopped up, okay? You got a cold, so your nose is stopped up. Maybe your ear pressure's not so good, so your hearing's not so good. So the smells aren't going to be as intense. Maybe you're not hungry because your stomach's kind of upset, so you're not like thinking of the taste of the food and all that. But the shape of the pizza parlor, the building shape, is the same. And if you go, don't do this, but if you walked up to the building and squeezed the building, it'd still be just as dense as it was before. So he thinks that, again, these secondary qualities seem to be dependent on me and my condition, or the conditions that surround me, and the primary qualities seem to be something that emanate from the actual object itself. Now Berkeley, he's an interesting character, because when we get to Berkeley, he doesn't actually think that there should be a distinction. He says, well, ultimately, all of these senses end up in the same place. And so for him, this distinction between primary and secondary qualities is misleading. Ultimately, whether I hear something or see it or feel it or anything, what is it that's doing all of the seeing and touching? It's not really my organs. which you might say, well, I smell with my nose, I hear with my ears, I see with my eyes, etc. But Berkeley's going to say, no, you don't. Those are the tools that you use to hear, see, smell, blah, blah, blah. What is it ultimately that actually senses all of these things, ultimately? I mean, let's say you were just a nose with legs. All you were a nose, just a nose, walking around on two legs, like in that short story by Gogol, the nose, right? Would you really smell anything? You're just a walking nose? Berkeley says you wouldn't. Why not? Why would a nose not smell anything? It's not attached to anything. It's just a nose. Well, does a camera actually see stuff?
Nope.
No, it records things, but can you go ask a camera what it saw? Hey, camera, could you tell me what happened yesterday? Could you tell me? No, you got to push play on the damn thing, right? It records, but it doesn't know it's recording. So what is it that actually sees, ultimately, you think? Not
the person, the user.
Well, yeah, the user, but ultimately their mind, okay? That's the answer I was looking for. Your mind, okay? If you had no mind, you had no brain, nothing, no mind, but you had all your organs, would you have any senses? Berkeley says no. And I guess I agree with him to a certain extent. So for him, perception is always mental. It's always in the mind. And what makes him an empiricist, to be is to be perceived. And this is his slogan, et si et percepi. Right? To be is to be perceived. To exist, when I say something exists, when I say something is, what that means is that it is an object of perception. I'm able to see it. I'm able to hear it, see it, imagine it, whatever. And what is perceiving? A mind. The mind is what perceives. All perceptions are perceptions of the mind. And so this is why I say he's kind of an interesting character, because not only is Berkeley an empiricist, all existence is tied to perception. You know, it's all experiential. Experience and being are sort of synonymous. To be is to be perceived. But he's also an idealist. Berkeley's philosophy is a form of idealism. We've seen idealism before with Plato, but Plato is kind of special. He's got a very special kind of, Plato is an idealist because he thought that the forms, the ideas, the higher realm of forms are what are really real. Everything else is less real and derived from that higher reality of ideas. And so he's got a very unique idealism. The ideas in Plato are separate from any person having them. Whether or not you know the forms, they exist. They're eternal. They're unchanging. But Berkeley, he's an idealist in the more typical sense of that word. So not only does he think that being is tied to perception, so he's an empiricist, but he thinks all these perceptions are simply in a mind. Everything that ever was, ever is, ever has been, is simply a mind, a perception in a mind. He's basically asserting what Descartes said would be absurd. This idea that there's a thing in itself, right? Remember John Locke, he's like, I don't know, there's a thing out there, I don't know what it is. It's something I know not what. David Hume, he's the last one we're going to get to. He's just like, who knows and who cares? Let's just give it up. Berkeley actually says something that Descartes would say, this can't be the case. But Berkeley asserts it's true. The thing in itself, it's not out there. There are no things out there. Everything that is either in my mind or your mind or some mind somewhere. All things that exist are thoughts. They're all ideas. They're all representations in the mind. There's no external object. The thing in itself is your experience of the thing. And remember Descartes, he thought that couldn't be true because that would be very deceptive. We really have an inclination to believe that things exist outside of us. We have an intuition, and so why would God give us that intuition if it's not true? But Berkeley says, no, that's silly. If you just think about it, you know that it's what I'm right, and that really everything's just perceptions in the mind, and it's really common sense. Berkeley thinks he's more common sense than Descartes. In fact, Berkeley thinks that well, this is the other part you might ask too. I'm going to hold off on what I was just about to say. I'm jumping ahead of the game here. You might push back on him and say, well, wait a minute, Berkeley, you're basically telling me that if something is not being perceived by some mind somewhere, it no longer exists. So to be is to be perceived. If you're not being perceived, you don't exist. Is that what you're saying, Berkeley? And he's going to say, yes, that's what I'm saying. So if I leave my house and there's no one here to look at it, everything inside of it just disappears until I come back home? Yep, that's true. That seems absurd. And he might say, well, you just thought about your house. You were telling me about your house. So you were thinking about it. It's existing. That's not going to work, though. You know, I'm going to think about every book on my bookshelf, every speck of dust on my desk. You know, no. But for Berkeley, he doesn't want to assert that. He wants to believe that, yes, the building still exists when people leave it. You know, your room is still there when you walk out of the room. It doesn't disappear. But he still wants to maintain this to be is to be perceived. For Berkeley, though, he was a very religious man, so he sees a way out. Bishop Berkeley. What's he going to say? You know, how does the building exist if I'm not there to see it? He's going to say, well, someone's always there to perceive it. You ever heard the old question, if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? What do you think the answer to that one is? If there's a tree in the woods and it falls down and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound?
I think
Well, I'm
yes.
pretty sure the animals will hear it.
Oh yeah, those darn animals. Those darn animals. All right, what if it was like all the animals were asleep?
Yeah, I guess nobody would hear it because other trees don't have ears.
Right. So it wouldn't make a sound? Well, Berkeley says it would make a sound because there's always someone there to hear it. There's this universal hearer. Who might that be, you think? Our old buddy.
God.
Yes, your old friend God, come to save the day. Yes. So Berkeley thinks, yes, of course, the tree makes a sound because God heard it. God hears everything at all times. You might be wondering, though, does Berkeley have a proof for God's existence? All these philosophers that talk about God, Berkeley's one of them. They all have a proof. You know, Descartes got a proof for God's existence. Leibniz, Spinoza, they all have these proofs. Whether or not they're effective, that's debatable. But what is Berkeley's proof? He makes a pretty strong assertion. He says that he's even more certain of God's existence than he is of his own perceptions. So he says it's more likely that God exists than my perceptions are real. You know, he's more willing to think his perceptions are false than to think that God is not real. And why is he so certain of that? Because he says, well, the only reason I could have these perceptions is God. God could be the only cause for them. I don't create my existence. I'm just here. I didn't decide to exist. I didn't, if it was all just me and I just had control over everything, it was all just in my mind, then I could imagine whatever I wanted. I could walk through walls. I could fly. But obviously I can't do that. There are limits to what I can do. So something must have created these limits. And these limits are fantastic. If you look at the world, there's a lot of possibilities. But there's also strict laws. So there must have been a creator of all these possibilities and a creator of all these laws. And the only thing that could have possibly done all this was a being that's so amazing that it could have done all this stuff. And God's the only being that's that awesome. So God must exist so that all this that I see exists. And to me, that's a fairly weak argument. Even fellow empiricists, David Hume, point this out. So now we're finally to David Hume. David Hume's very skeptical of this and says, look, you can't do this. What you're basically doing here is you're using this notion of cause and effect. You're looking at things around you and saying, well, things usually have a cause, or they always have a cause. And so whatever caused the thing must be sufficient. This is the classic principle of sufficient reason, which I think we covered way, way back. I'm trying to find it. I don't know. I guess I might not have written it out in our, looking at my handouts here, or my, oh, here it is. Yeah. The principle of sufficient reason. Remember, everything that exists for a reason. It was caused by something, and whatever caused it must be sufficient, must be enough. And so Berkeley is kind of classically using this to prove God. There must be a reason for the entire universe, and whatever caused the entire universe must be enough to cause the entire universe. And the only thing that's enough to cause the entire universe would be God. But Hume sort of says, well, for one, you're making a big leap. When we make this jump from cause to effect, it involves a leap. And we're going to talk about this in just a moment. So I'm going to hold off on that particular objection. This is something that troubles Kant. So we'll get to this towards the end. Okay, so one problem that Berkeley's doing here is he's trying to derive a cause from the effect. And there's problems with that. We'll get to those in a moment. The other thing, he's misapplying this principle of sufficient reason. All the principle says is for each individual thing, every event, every object, there must be a cause for that event. There must be a cause for that object. It doesn't say there must be one cause, one unified cause for all events taken together as a whole. That's not how the principle works. That would be, maybe that'd be equivalent to me asking you something like this. Let's just imagine that you have, for some reason, met like 10 to 15 people in the last month. You've met 10 to 15 people that were all from Milwaukee. And they all moved here from Milwaukee. Every one of them. And none of them know each other. It's just a coincidence. You bump into one at the gas station. You make small talk with them while you're pumping gas. Oh, you moved here from Milwaukee. Why'd you do that? Got a job offer. You go to the bar a week later. You're having a drink at the bar. Someone sits next to you. Y'all start chatting up. They're from Milwaukee. What are you doing here? Oh, my mom is from here. She's not doing well health-wise. I'm here to take care of her, whatever, right? So this keeps happening, okay? Hey, do you know this other person I met from? Oh, I never heard of him. I don't know that person. None of them know each other. They're all here from Milwaukee. So you're telling your friend this. You're saying, hey, man, this is so weird. You're not going to believe it. I keep meeting all these people from Milwaukee. What's the deal? And you start telling them about all this stuff. You start mentioning, I met this one guy at the gas station. I met this woman at the bar. I met this. And then your friend stops you and says, wait a minute. What's the one reason why they're all here? And you're like, well, there's not one reason. Like, one of them's here for a job. One's here to take care of their mom. One got stationed here military. And no, your friend interrupts you. There has to be one reason, one unified reason why every one of them is here from Milwaukee. There has to be. Does there? I mean, maybe there is, and it's a big conspiracy, and they're all trying to trick me or something. That's a big joke on me, but maybe it's just coincidence, right? Like, maybe it's just, there doesn't necessarily have to be one cause for all these different events. See what I'm saying? And Berkeley's trying to make this argument that there has to be one cause for every entire thing that's ever happened and ever will happen. One cause? And Hume is like, well, wait a minute. Even if I allow you to do that, why would there be one cause? Maybe there's like several causes. Like, it seems like the more complicated a system is, the more designers you need, right? If you've got, a really complicated structure like a skyscraper, you need several people to build it. you know, you might be able to build a log cabin with one person, but you can't build a skyscraper with one person. So if you want to say that everything was created by a thing, maybe it was several things. Maybe there was a committee of gods or builders. I mean, Hume is just agnostic about this. He says philosophy needs to stop. We need to stop trying to answer these questions. These are beyond the limits of human understanding. And so we need to be a little bit more modest about our assertions and just stick to what we can observe and what kind of habits and sort of laws of observations that we can develop. Other than that, we need to be humble about our assertions about anything to do with underlying causes of everything. And so Hume is quite skeptical when it comes to this. Okay, and so now we're finally getting pretty close to the end here of the modern period or the early modern period. And I want to keep it brief because this can get a lot more complicated. I know, you know, I mean, we've already talked about so many different topics today. I want to keep it to a minimum. But this distinction between a priori and a posteriori reasoning is something we need to get down, because we're going to talk about it, maybe not in depth, but it's going to come up from time to time in the next couple readings in Sartre and also maybe to a lesser extent in Nietzsche. But this is something that David Hume does not point out. He's not the first philosopher to use this jargon and use these terms. But he says something about this type of reasoning that causes quite a stir. I mentioned earlier that David Hume attacked philosophers like Leibniz and Spinoza for doing natural religion, right? So let's go to, remember the Leibniz and Spinoza were using philosophy and what they thought of as mathematical science to explain not just the universe, but God and the ways of God, and to basically prove some of their religious convictions, or what they thought proved their religious convictions. And Hume was absolutely opposed to this. He thought that philosophy had limits, and that was one of them. Philosophy could not tell you about the resurrection or about, you know, the final judgment. These were not the business of science and philosophy. This is not stuff that the human mind, even Hume thought, could wrap itself around. But what it could know, David Hume thought, were pretty useful things, namely relations of ideas on the one hand and matters of fact on the other. So when we talk about knowing things for David Hume, they roughly fall under these two categories: relations of ideas and matters of fact. Now, coming back to that jargon, what the heck, a priori, a posteriori? Well, these are different forms of reasoning. These are different forms of knowledge. And what David Hume is going to say is that very little things that we're going to call knowledge, or things that we know, there are very few things that are known through a priori reasoning. And these are what he calls relations of ideas. And what a priori means is these are things that I can know without referring to the world outside, without referring to the state of the universe, without referring to any context. And for David Hume, the only thing that really falls under these categories are things like geometry, arithmetic, truths of mathematics. They are just true because of the nature of the ideas themselves. Because a triangle is an idea of a three-sided figure, there are truths that are just a priori true. You know that if a figure is a triangle, you know that no matter what kind of triangle it is, you don't have to know if it's an isosceles or whether it's an equilateral triangle or any other kind of triangle. You know, scalene, you know that triangle, all the angles are going to add up to 180. Okay, that's known a priori. You don't have to look at the piece of paper. You don't have to measure the angles. Once you understand the concept of a triangle, you know through a priori reasoning all these other truths. So this simply has to do with how ideas relate to each other. You know, the fact that 2 times 15 is 30 and half of 60 is 30. Right? These are just how numbers, units, quantities relate to each other. Okay, that's a priori reasoning. Everything else for Hume is pretty much a matter of fact. And matters of fact are only known through a posteriori reasoning. In other words, you have to consult the state of the universe. You have to consult the state of something that can only be known after one looks at the relevant facts. So for instance, if I say that the sun will rise tomorrow, when will I know that that statement is true? So I'm going to say the sun is going to rise tomorrow. Well, when do I know for sure that that's a fact? Do I know it
As the
right?
sun rises.
Well, when it rises. That's what Hume says, at least. I don't know that the sun is going to rise until it. Now he's going to bet that it does. You know, if you want to put down a bet, Hume's going to say, "Yeah, I'll take that bet. I bet that it will rise tomorrow." The point is, though, you don't know until it does. You don't know with any sort of mathematical certainty. You don't know until after the fact. It's not something you know till it's a posteriori. Right? You know it in a way that's a posteriori. The only thing you know with certainty are things like, you know, the thing about the triangles, you know, circles, you know, geometrical, mathematical truths. Those are true regardless of what happens tomorrow or the day before or the day after or 5 weeks from now or 10 months ago or 12 years from now. Like none of those, the facts will not change about triangles. But why do I believe, why do I think that the sun will rise tomorrow? We all think it's true. What's that based on? And he thinks we should believe it. He's not asking us to doubt it. But why do we believe it? What's that based on? You know, I believe it, but why? Why would I believe that? Why would I believe such a thing? That the sun will rise tomorrow? I don't know. I can't see in the future. But yet I have this confidence that it's going to happen. Why? Why am I so confident about it? I am.
Maybe because it happened in the past.
Exactly. And that's the only basis. At least this is Hume's argument. This is the only basis. It just happened that way before. It's always happened that way. And he says that's not really a good argument. He says it's a necessary argument. It's all you're doing is you're establishing probability. You're not establishing certainty. It's highly probable, given all your experience in the past, that it's going to happen the way in the future. But it's not certain. You don't know with absolute certainty. And so for David Hume, this applies to all science. Anything that we say about science typically has to do with cause and effect, okay? But when we're trying to connect a cause to an effect, it's always based on previous experience. We don't do it with mathematical reasoning. We do it with observation. Under these conditions, this thing has always happened. So under the similar conditions, it's going to happen that way again. But we never know with certainty until it happens. And we fool ourselves because we get so used to this. He uses the example of, you know, if you're really good at playing pool or billiards, he talks about billiards. You're a good pool player. You think, man, if I hold the pool stick at this angle and I hit the cue ball with this much pressure at this angle, I know I'm going to get my shot. It's going to hit the strike ball there. It's going to knock into there. And if you're really good at pool and you know the physics of the game, you might say, well, it's a law. It's a freaking law of physics, you know. But Hume's going to say, well, you don't know if you're going to make your shot until you take the shot. You don't know, someone might open the door to the pool hall and the gust of wind comes in, or there might be a pebble beneath the felt of the pool table that makes the cue ball go off its course, but you don't know until after the fact. And so Hume, typically his examples, he's focusing on a lot of theological arguments because a lot of these philosophers before him were using the notion of cause and effect and talking about how if you understand the laws of nature, well, first, understand God's reasonable and rational. The laws of nature must be reasonable and rational. Understand the laws of nature, and you can predict with certainty what's going to happen in future events. And Hume says, no, that whole process is wrong, but any prediction of future events is basically based on previous events and is completely a posteriori and not certain. It could be wrong. You know, I'm going to go with it. Hume's going to say, look, if I eat breakfast at the same place every morning and I get a good breakfast and I get good service, I'm pretty confident it's a good place to go. I'm going to go there every day. You know, but is it guaranteed that it's always going to be that way? You know, I mean, let's say every morning I wake up and I go to my car and I put the key in the ignition and I turn the key and the car starts. It's always happened that way in the past. So therefore, it's always going to happen that way in the future. Is that a good argument, you think? I mean, is that a guarantee?
No, especially for something that deals with you turning your key in the ignition.
Right. Certainly. And that's the problem, he says, is that these philosophers apply this principle to everything. And he's like, it's very uncertain. And so when we're dealing with the universe as a whole, when we're dealing with cause and effect, you know, we can't ever know with certainty that something caused something else. There's always the possibility. Now, Hume warns us against supernatural explanations. He's what you might call a scientific naturalist. He thinks every explanation that we give scientifically should be a natural one. We shouldn't talk about, you know, monads and invisible things. And, yeah, so he's very opposed to this. But even the science that we do construct should be very, the word tentative, right? So it's the best story we have so far, given the information and what we know and given past experience. But we always have to be amenable to the fact that it could go wrong. It could, you know, he says, like, you know, if, let's say your friend is in the country or your friend is in France, and someone asks you, how do you know that? How do you know he's in the country? How do you know he's in France? What you're going to do is you're going to say, well, he has a picture. He sent me a letter. He posted photos on Instagram in the Eiffel Tower. And David Hume's going to say, well, geez, I trust my friends. I believe that he's in France. But is it a mathematical certainty that he's in France? Is it, you know, undeniably, there's no way? I mean, maybe he's lying to you. Maybe he made up that story. Maybe he used Photoshop to put fake photos on Instagram where it looks like he's in France, but he's really not. Okay, maybe that's a bad example now because no one can go to France because of the lockdown or whatever, but you get the point. So we're always sort of uncertain. Now, Kant, when he reads David Hume, he actually takes David Hume seriously, and he's one of the first to do so. David Hume did not enjoy a lot of esteem as a philosopher during his lifetime. Now he's considered one of the greats. You know, most people consider him one of, if not the most important philosopher who ever wrote in English, in the English language. But that wasn't in the cards for him during his lifetime. You know, he died thinking himself a failure. He thought he deserved it because he thought he demolished all this philosophy before him, particularly like the natural religion of Leibniz and Spinoza. But he was ignored. But when Kant read him, Kant took him serious, and Kant was more or less a rationalist. And after he reads the empiricists, but particularly Hume, he realizes that, look, we've got to change the way we do philosophy, and this begins what's known as the Copernican revolution in philosophy that Kant enacts. And I won't get too much into that because, you know, he's a difficult philosopher to explain. But he's basically sort of the short answer to Kant. You know, he's sort of in the middle between the empiricists and the rationalists. You know, Descartes, remember, he says that in order to know the wax, it's not my senses, you know, it's just my mind. You know, if I just went with my senses, the wax is changing in all these different shapes and all these different colors. So I have to say it's a different piece every time. And I, you know, my mind, my understanding is what knows that it's the wax. And then the empiricists are like, no, your experience, if you didn't have any experience of an avocado, for instance, you wouldn't know what an avocado tastes like if you never tasted it. You have to have the actual experience to have the thought or the idea. So you have to have some content, not just the mind alone. Well, Kant kind of takes both those views, puts them together. You know, for Kant, if a mind is all by itself, that's empty. There's nothing there, right? A mind alone has nothing to think. There's no experience at all. On the other hand, the empiricists are right. If all you were was just some sensory collector, then there, obviously experience has some coherency to it. We take all these inputs, we take all this sense data, all the things that we see, hear, touch, and we organize them. We don't notice every little minute detail about everything. We pick out things. We conceptualize things. We make them into this sort of whole. And that's basically Kant's, kind of approach to this. This is his solution to the whole rationalist versus empiricist debate. But when it comes to David Hume, he's pretty much on the same page with him, but wants to push back on this insistence that all reasonings about the world around us are a posteriori. In other words, that there aren't things we can know about the physical world that we can know with absolute certainty in a way that's a priori, that's non-contextual. And so Kant brings up, Newtonian physics. What about Newton's laws? Is anyone familiar with Newton's laws, any of Newton's laws, like law of conservation, inertia, thermodynamics? No one knows Newton's laws. They used to teach this to us, back in the day, even in biology, but like general science classes. I took physics in college, so I remember it from physics, but I remember learning them as a kid. Now, I'm sure you know them. You just probably forgot them. Newton's laws? No one? I'll give you a couple.
Yeah, I'm
forgot.
familiar with it. It's
Okay.
just high school stuff.
Yeah. Can you remember how they go? What's one of them?
Well, I know the law of inertia isn't one where something that's going one way it'll stop if something equal. Something like that. I don't know.
Sounds like you're about to mix up a couple of them. So yeah,
yeah.
One of them's like an object in motion stays in motion unless it's acted on by an outside force.
Yeah, that's it.
Object at rest stays at rest unless it's acted upon by an outside force. And then there's the other one, which is like, what is it? For every action, there's an equal opposite reaction.
Yeah, that's how it goes.
Yeah. So Kant says, look, those laws are a priori. You don't have to wait and see what will happen. Every time there's an action, there's an equal opposite reaction. These are just true, regardless of the context, regardless. So these are a priori truths. So Newtonian physics would be, I guess, an argument against Hume. Hume's going to say, well, I mean, Hume never really had to answer these questions. I don't think he was really thinking so much about scientific laws. He was attacking some of these religious philosophers who were using philosophy to kind of prop up theology. But Kant's thinking, well, you got to apply it to everything, Hume, and this is problematic for science. And I'm sorry, but scientific laws are a priori. I have a feeling that Hume would push back and say, well, maybe they're not. Like maybe Newton's laws are only true based on what we've seen so far. Like so far in the entire universe, for every action, there's an equal opposite reaction. So far, but maybe like in the future, like the laws of physics will change. I'm not really quite sure. I don't want to speak for Hume. That's probably not super fair, but I have a feeling he might be skeptical. It's not that he would reject Newton's laws. I think he would accept them. He'd be like, yeah, I think they're useful tools and we should use them to understand our world. We have to understand, though, that they are tools that might not be perfect tools and they might slightly be inaccurate, right? And maybe there might be future events where we see physical phenomenon that don't fit these laws, that violate these laws. And I don't know enough about quantum physics to comment on it, but you might, if you're a quantum physicist, you might say, yeah, he's kind of got a point there. Now we're finally going to get to ethics here and talking about moral laws, because Kant actually thinks this is another type of a judgment or type of reasoning that is a priori. Kant thinks that ethical laws, moral laws are a priori, that they tell you how to act in all situations, no matter who you are, no matter what you are, regardless of the outcomes, regardless of the consequences, this is the right thing to do. And when we get to the next reading, when we get to Jean-Paul Sartre, we're going to see that this is a big problem for him. Jean-Paul Sartre is living in, a pretty tumultuous time. He had just survived World War II, the Nazi occupation of France. Europe is devastated. Millions and millions of people have lost their lives in bloody, violent struggle, and they're looking for answers. People are looking for answers. You know, Western civilization has fallen apart. What did we do wrong? How did we go wrong? And what's the answer? And the Kantian approach would be like, well, just be good, and here's your duty, and always act in a certain way that's, you know, universally applicable. And Sartre is going to say, look, there aren't any values, ethical or otherwise, that are a priori. All values that we have, everything we find valuable and we care about, Sartre's going to argue, is a human construct. We create values, not in a vacuum, you know, but we do create values, and we have to hold ourselves responsible and accountable for those values. But his critics are going to say, well, then that means there's no rules, and that means anything goes. And so it can't be that way, Sartre. You've got to have an answer. Otherwise, what's the difference between killing millions and saving millions? And so he thinks there is a difference, and he's going to try to defend his doctrine against the critics. But that's basically the focus on the next essay. I didn't get to say as much about Kant as I'd like to today, but we're running out of time. I thought we'd get done early, but I was sorely mistaken. But I'm glad we got through what we did get through. But for next class, we're probably going to spend at least a good first half of it just talking about Sartre in general, and then maybe like the last 30 or 45 minutes we'll actually get to the reading. So try to read. I would try to read at least the first 15 or so pages of the Jean-Paul Sartre textbook. But other than that, there's no homework, just a bunch of reading. I'm going to try to get your Descartes essays graded as soon as possible. I think some people have already turned them in. Aren't those due today? Or no, they're due Thursday, right? They're due day after tomorrow. So, you know, some of y'all are still working on them. Some of them turned in. If I get a chance, I'll start grading them early. But I'm still catching up on some people are turning in their Play-Doh ones because there was some mistakes. Well, like I said, that's it for me today. I'll stick around for just a moment here to answer anybody's questions, but